It's time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world to hear their views on issues making headlines. As we wrap up the year of 2021, we look back on major trade issues in the second year of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we also project what's to come in the coming year. For this, we have the honour of connecting with John A. Quelch, Dean of the Herbert Business School in the University of Miami. Welcome back on our programme, Professor Quelch. It's lovely to see you.
Thank you, Sion.
And well, we have quite a number of questions for you today as we look to wrap up the year. And well, first of all, this ongoing supply chain issue. So first of all, what led to this ongoing crisis this year, and why has it been so difficult to resolve?
First of all, COVID did cause the closure, unscheduled closure of many manufacturing plants and ports, and that really did disrupt the global supply chain. In addition to that, the Chinese government issued mandates regarding the non-use of coal to essentially manufacture electricity. And so as a result of those restrictions, there were a number of plant shutdowns or curtailed production in Chinese manufacturing plants. And then on top of that, the rebound of consumer demand as we came out of the first wave of COVID was much stronger than expected, and this led to a misalignment of very high demand alongside disrupted supply chains.
Well, many have been asking when this supply chain issue is going to end, but do you see it stretching on into next year? And also, how would you advise companies to really secure their supply chains going forward?
So it depends a little bit on the nature of the product. If we're talking about simple products that are easy to manufacture and replicable and not dependent upon particular ingredients or raw materials that are in short supply, then I see a period of around about 3 months before those supply chains come back into order. But if we're talking about items, particularly technology-based items that depend on very specific raw material inputs, where those raw materials have to be shipped around the world to specific production plant locations. Those kinds of products may be longer, could be as long as 6 months before the demand supply comes back into balance. If you take, for example, an automobile, a typical car these days would be containing components from many, many countries. And accordingly, if just one of those components is in short supply, or the supply chain is uncertain, problematic, disrupted, then the entire car production process grinds to a halt. So it's still going to remain a serious issue for about 6 months for complicated and more technically oriented products.
And well, even before this supply chain issue occurred and before the outbreak of COVID-19, there were other disruptions to global trade, such as trade disputes and a rise of nationalism that turned into a lot of protectionism. And well, before the Biden administration took office, many were waiting to see if he would take steps to join the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership deal that former President Obama was really pushing for, but then President Trump abandoned. But then America's still it's still keeping out of that pact, and it doesn't seem to have been pursuing more trade-friendly policies that one may have thought. First of all, do you think the US should rejoin the CPTPP?
Yes, I do. The principal problem that President Biden is facing is that he must pass his domestic agenda before he can turn his energy and the energy of the White House towards foreign affairs and foreign diplomacy. I think there is an appetite in the Biden administration to push for fair and free trade, similar to the Obama administration, but one has to remember that Senator and now President Biden comes from more of a trade union background in his political makeup than President Obama. And so he is more sensitive to union representation regarding the preservation of American jobs vis-a-vis those jobs going offshore to foreign suppliers. In addition, the Biden administration is perhaps a little bit more into the human rights issues and worker rights issues than the Obama administration. So I expect to see movement on the fair and free trade pacts that the United States might potentially join or at least negotiate with, but I don't expect to see it quite as forceful as during the Obama administration.
And well, second, do you think the US has any plans to deepen its trade ties in the Indo-Pacific? I mean, President Biden has been emphasizing the importance of the Quad countries and exploring more trade links. Do you think he has any plans on moving forward?
The demographic and economic realities are that there has to be a pivot to Asia as far as the United States is concerned. That is one reason why the United States withdrew from Afghanistan, withdrew its forces, so that it was no longer potentially as bogged down in the Afghan and Middle East issues that were perhaps distracting it and sucking some of the oxygen in foreign policy away from the pivot to Asia. Whether or not that continues to hold remains to be seen. The United States has to rebuild its relationships with European nations, which it is, of course, doing after the Trump administration derailed those relationships. So, yes, there is the pivot to Asia. There is an appetite for investing more in Asian diplomacy.
And of course, as you mentioned, countering or balancing China was one of the big reasons behind America's pivot to Asia. And well, the Biden administration has been maintaining its pressure on China and its decoupling policy, it seems. But there also seems to be mixed views on whether the decoupling is actually taking place, as China continues to dominate global trade and the G2 economies are still pretty much interdependent. So how do you see things, Professor Quelch? Do you think this decoupling is proceeding, and do you think it's going to continue?
There's no question that economic decoupling is impossible. We have conceded low-cost manufacturing to China as the factory to the world, with all due respect, of course, to Samsung and many outstanding Korean manufacturers, as well as Japanese. But largely, global manufacturing is concentrated in China. There's no question that to change that, to reorganize those supply chains would be very time-consuming and actually, frankly, expensive to American consumers who would end up having to pay higher prices. So decoupling economically is simply not possible, and we can see, despite all of President Trump's efforts, that the trade level between China and the US has sustained itself. In fact, it's increased despite those efforts. But I think there's a positive here as well, and that is that, in my mind, as a global citizen, trade and foreign direct investment are two of the best guarantees for peace. And where there is peace, there is prosperity. So I'm not in favor of decoupling, and I don't believe it's practical.
Well, unfortunately, though, we are seeing the geopolitical rivalry between Washington and Beijing intensifying, and there's still some anger in Europe following Brexit and the formation of a security pact between the UK, Australia and the US. Well, do you see, in light of these trends, trade links around the world changing or new trade blocs emerging around the world?
Well, I'm very, very hopeful that there will be increased trade negotiations towards a fairer and freer trade regime worldwide. That is not typically practical these days on a global basis. The last effort of that nature was really the Doha round in Qatar over a decade ago, and that did not result in a global rebalancing of trade. So subsequent to the Doha round, individual countries negotiated bilateral agreements with each other, regional blocs negotiated with individual nations or with each other. Yes, there could be some additional blocs that could emerge, potentially in Africa and the Middle East in particular, are places where the level of intra-country trade and the free movement of goods within countries within those regions is not as good as it should be. But overall, I think what we have to do is make sure that the existing trading blocs work. And there are many of them, and they need to work harder, better, and more effectively on behalf of the citizens of the countries that are represented in those trading blocs. And what do the citizens of those countries want? They want high quality goods from wherever they can be sourced in the world at competitively low prices, and they want access to innovations that emerge in some countries to be promptly available in all countries. These are the fundamental issues that citizens are looking for, in my view, and trade negotiators should always keep those tenets in mind when they're at the negotiating tables.
Well, since autumn this year, we've seen the word Evergrande just make headlines everywhere on a weekly basis, it seems. And well, China's property developers are in hot water at the moment, and China's banking authorities did their best very recently to reassure investors by releasing $190 billion in money supply for lending. Do you see any hope of the situation getting better, or do you think we're about to see this, we're seeing a slow motion collapse of that sector? And also, do you think the world is going to see any significant spillover effects?
Well, the Chinese government cannot afford to allow that sector to collapse because such a high proportion of Chinese middle class and upper middle class people are invested in real estate, and that is because, of course, the banking system in China does not pay competitive interest rates for retail deposits. And in addition to that, the stock markets in China still have, rightly or wrongly, the reputation of being somewhat like a casino. And so many Chinese have invested in real estate. But the fact of the matter is that many of the investments are speculative and not directed towards residents actually living in their own homes. And you only have to take a little boat trip down the Hangpo River at night in Shanghai to see how many apartments in the high-rise buildings overlooking the Hangpo River are unlit. They don't have their lights on, and that's because they're not occupied. They are speculative investment properties. And sooner or later, there has to be a rebalancing of the Chinese economy and the Chinese GDP away from the heavy dependency, the heavy representation of the real estate sector. But the fact of the matter is that the government simply cannot afford to let that sector collapse.
The year of 2021, it was generally a good year for South Korea. It was recognized as a developed economy earlier this year by the UN Conference on Trade and Development. And the volume of exports, it reached a historic high as of November. But due to the country's rather heavy dependence on semiconductors and automobiles, there's been concerns about the sustainability of economic growth here. Do you see any opportunities or areas of growth for South Korea?
Well, first of all, I'm delighted that the UN conference has finally recognized the reality of Korea as a developed economy. I thought that debate had been concluded around about 10 years ago, if not longer. You know, Korea is an outstanding nation with respect to innovation. And I think that we're talking here not just about automobiles and electronics, but also about Korea's cultural assets as well. And I believe that as Korean culture, and let's take K-pop as an example, becomes better known internationally, that the concept of branded products that are made in Korea will become even more attractive. So on the consumer side, consumer goods and services, I would see tremendous upside potential for Korea. And I think the level of innovation and R&D investment in Korea, as long as that is sustained, if not increased, as a proportion of GDP, that things will continue to look very bright for Korea. And let's not forget that in addition, in terms of the rebalancing of world trade and the political issues associated with the world economy, the United States has a lot of interest in making sure that Japan and Taiwan and Korea all do extremely well. And so there's going to be a lot of cooperation between those countries, I think, in terms of facilitating technical advances in AI, in machine learning, in all of the other areas of technology that we know are going to govern our lives in the next 50 years.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. That was John Quelch, Dean of the Herbert Business School in the University of Miami. As always, it's such a privilege to hear your insights. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.